fascinating session we've had on sustainability. So I'm at Murdoch University. I'm not in the wetlands area, but I'm in renewable and sustainable energy. So sustainability is a big part of what I do, and in terms of things like climate change management, etc. But we've seen a great session there, and I haven't been to all the talks, but I've seen talks on the rights of wetlands, the desire to protect them, ensure their ongoing health and biodiversity, and thanks, Gavin, and the importance of stories in building our connections with these wetlands. One thing that I'd like to see as part of going forward and smart cities programs is smart wetlands, and we've seen some really cutting-edge science here. I was on talks on eDNA, next-generation sequencing. We saw talks now about drones, LiDAR, and artificial intelligence, and I really hope that we can see some of that being applied to the lakes around here. That would be fantastic. Okay, so if you didn't have chance to ask a question in the session that you were in and you had questions, here's a chance to ask any of the speakers some questions. When you ask, if you could please just stand up while you're asking your questions. Okay, do we have any questions out there? Yes. So I think Felicity had a question.
Hello.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Good, thank you.
Yes.
I'd just like to ask a question, please, about is there any moral or ethical level when you're flying drones over wetlands and disturbance of wildlife?
Absolutely valid question. So there are, in the recent past, there has been quite a lot of guidelines being developed, and there has been actual objective studies being done to understand what height and what flight patterns disturb animals. So this has been done largely on birds, but also for sea turtles and a few other things. So they're not rules per se, they are more so guidelines. So you can follow them or not. But a lot of research on this nature would require animal ethics approval, so you would have to address those before you start research. But yeah, there's certainly, we have a fairly good understanding of what level of drone activity cause disturbance to animals. On the other hand, it's also a danger for the drone to fly over a flock of birds, for example. So there are quite a lot of considerations in that space.
I live Lake Forestdale, and we have a nice boardwalk there, and a lot of people come out, these amateurs, and they like to do their test runs with their drones because they can see the whole thing up in the sky, flying around, and there's no sort of rules, they just come out and do what they like. So I just think there should be some sort of information for amateurs without controls.
It's one of those things that's very hard to control. There are certainly rules, so CASA, which is Civil Aviation Security Agency, CASA, governs people just flying drones for non-commercial purposes. There are certainly rules that you can't fly. For example, you can't fly a drone within 30 meters of humans or buildings or vehicles. That's the rule. But according to CASA also, the airspace above your house over 30 meters is public space. So you can pass over and do whatever you want as long as it's not over humans. So there are rules, but enforcing those is a different thing altogether. A lot of authorities don't know the rules, or there's no way of knowing where a drone comes from sometimes. So yeah, that certainly is a problem.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Roo. Any further questions?
Thanks. Struggling. I'm referring to the buffer talk from Michael. Firstly, I'd really like to thank Michael because I know he had to go to a bit of extreme above and beyond to make that talk, and really appreciate that. And I'm going to be that annoying person. It's not really a question. It's a bit of a statement. Actually, no, it's more than a statement. It's a request. So every time people hear things like the turtles are crossing the roads, or the houses have been inundated by, surprising flood, I want you to turn it around. I want you to think the roads are crossing the wetlands. The houses have been built in the wetlands. Every time you think that, it gives you a little bit, you're right, that's the wetlands. We've gone into the wetlands, and that's how we should be thinking about it. And when we're thinking about buffers, and as Michael said, it comes to an enormous cost in the long run if we come too close to the wetlands. I live right here in Bibra Lake. There's an area that's been built in there that wasn't supposed to be built in there when the original development was made. And surprise, surprise, people are trying to put swimming pools in there, and they're like, oh my God, there's water under the ground. And I'm like, yeah. So, sorry, that was my point. I think.
Okay, any member of the panel want to add to that?
I would take it as a comment. Yeah, I would take that as a comment, and I couldn't agree more. Thanks.
Okay, we have someone at the front here. Oh, yep, thank you.
Just following up on Michael's talk, are you working on or supporting reinstating the environmental protection policy for the wetlands of the Swan Coastal Plain?
I'm afraid I can't comment on that. I'm not personally, and it would come under the Environmental Protection Act, which is administered by a different agency, and I'm not in a position to comment on it, but I am unaware of work that's going in that direction.
But surely your advice would be incorporated into it in terms of protection of the wetlands.
I think, yeah, the policy obviously assists in the ongoing protection of wetlands. It identifies them, gives them a location in the landscape, and therefore the ability to start protecting them. It comes down to gaining community support and partnership to make that happen. And I think there's been a lot of circumstances where that partnership hasn't been able to be voiced and used to be part of the decision-making process. Sorry, I can't be more direct, but yeah.
It's a matter of environmental protection.
Okay, up the back. Yep.
Hi. I wanted to direct my question to Josie and Nicole for their eDNA talks, and really just looking at building the reference library for WA Wetlands. Josie's studies were limited because there wasn't many fish species having their genome in this reference library, and as a consultant I just wondered how we could kind of further that reference library, and if there's like specifically endangered species, do we need to take like a whole fish to get that sequence, or can we just take a small portion of tissue so that it can keep living?
Yeah, so we have a list if you want to know what fish we'd really like to target, or frogs or bird, we have lists. But no, you don't need to take a whole fish, just like a little fin clip would be more than enough tissue. Or you can even swab them. Like, it doesn't need to, like, you don't need to kill any animals to get DNA from them. No. Just as long as you're very sure on the IDs. That's the big thing. Because we do have a lot of, like, on the invertebrate side, we have a lot of invertebrates in our reference, but they don't have any taxonomic IDs attached to them. A lot of that is just because a lot of invertebrates don't have species names yet, which is something that needs to be done. But yeah, no, you don't need to kill animals to get genetics from them.
Michael and Drew possibly, and anybody else, Ross River and mosquitoes, and I was struck by your figure of 800 to 3,000 metres is the distance where the mosquitoes can travel and carry these things. So what does this say about much of the development already in place, and what would it say about future proposals?
Well, I think that it has to be part of the planning. It has to be part of the future planning because most developments are planned many years in advance, and so the need for protecting ongoing human health issues is integral in good planning and sustainable planning. So yes, it needs to be part of that. But I think we have to recognise that we're all part of that problem as well. We all want our homes. We all want to live in places that have aesthetic value. We all want cars. We all want roads. We all want schools, shopping centres, etc. So we're all part of the Western idea of comfortable lifestyles and improving our life. And so it's part. The planning is part of a bigger picture, and I think a number of people have touched on it. And so I don't think we can take part of the planning process in itself and expect it to solve the solution. It's got to be part of society having a voice and listening to the research and the science that tells us how we can start to, again, live how Aboriginal peoples have done for many thousands of years in balance and recognition. We're all part of the environment.
I'll come back to that later.
I'll just speak loudly. All the photos you showed of the lakes had people living inside the buffer zones. They're probably one of the most important stakeholders in the whole conversation. Has there been an effort or an opportunity to reach out to those people, to create a partnership with them, to educate them in providing better outcomes for the lake?
Yeah, I have got the hot topic today, haven't I? I think it is one of the problems in planning that, my own personal opinion, we should be thinking ahead to what the lifestyles are that have been created by urban developments. And there are so many developments that have taken place, and then the ongoing management is handed over to local government to pick up the bill. The example I gave of Herdsman Lake is one of those. Local councils spend a big budget on managing that system. We have issues all over the state managing Ramsar wetlands and national parks, which are influenced by people who live next to them, and people who don't like the odours that come from some of these wetlands, people that don't like the nuisance insects that breed in these wetlands. The pressure that they put on the managing of these natural resources is significant, and the way that fire is managed in the state, for instance, is another recognition of how society at the moment has its priorities, and it doesn't always account for the needs of nature and the needs of wetlands. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but I think it's an important one that should be addressed.
Just to speak to that whole cluster of questions, I think part of the reason that we've found ourselves in the situation where we need buffer zones is that we're telling the wrong stories about our relationships with the wetlands. We're telling the story that, oh, I live here and the lake is over here, not I am living in the lake. We're telling the story that my house flooded, not the story that I built my house in the swamp. And it's the fact that we can think of ourselves as living not in the wetlands is why we need these buffer zones, these exclusion zones, because while people probably shouldn't be living in a swamp, if they are, and they know that they are and they're telling that story, then they will manage their behaviour appropriately and hopefully take some responsibility for land management rather than thinking that land management is something that happens over there and I'm over here and it's not my problem. I hope that's
Okay, I
useful.
think we have one question.
Sorry, Mike. I'm so sorry. Kobe from local government, you know that. So, buffer presentation, you talked about the spatial difficulty in terms of allocating buffers, and for local government officers, it's a constant uphill battle. But the battle that we have is what should or rather shouldn't happen within wetland buffers, in particular things like drainage or developers trying to maintain a certain BAL rating within buffers. And 2.9 and its review doesn't quite really touch on that in great detail, and you talked about being hopeful of more detailed guidance coming. I wondered if you'd be able to provide a little bit more information as to when that might be, how distant in the horizon that may be.
And yeah, thanks for that question. The way buffers are just part of the answer, and another important part of that is how buffers are managed. And they have so many significant roles in maintaining wetland function and ecosystem services that I mentioned in my presentation. It's critical that they're managed well, and there's obviously many buffers that aren't vegetated and they're degraded and they're not able to be a part of that solution. And so the way buffers are managed will be important, and if guidance, and I'm hopeful guidance will come out eventually on appropriate buffer planning, will include guidance on how to manage those buffers for their own sustainability. And so yes, that has always been part of the planning, that the guidance on how to manage the buffers will be critical. And it already is in the advice that's presented to development proposals and part of the environmental impact assessment, the need for ongoing management. When that will happen, I can't say. The Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage are the lead agency for the development of SPP 2.9 and the various pieces of guidance underneath that. DBCA partner with DWA, Department of Water and Environment Regulation, in providing input into that process, but our Minister is not the lead for that to happen. We're doing our best, and both agencies are working very hard to ensure that all that information is provided and that planning are aware of the critical importance of it, which I'm sure they are aware. But as I said also in my presentation, there are so many conflicting and sources of information going to the planning process that we're just one of the voices, or a couple of the voices in it. We're loud and persistent, but it is a difficult process unless everyone in the community are involved, and at this stage we don't seem to have the governance mechanisms to allow that to effectively happen.
Just keeping my eye on the time. Have we got a set time to 5 minutes? Okay, so perhaps a couple more questions.
Yeah, this one's not a question, Mike, so you can relax for a bit. I just thought I'd respond to the question about dealing with landholders that live in the buffer zone. So in the Peel Harbour, which I spoke about yesterday, we have Lake Clifton. We have lots of lakes, but Lake Clifton's a good example where it's on the northeastern side. We have about 100 odd residents, rural residential. So they're living in what should be the buffer zone. It's too late, I mean, they're living there, but it's the role of community groups like us, I think that's where we've stepped in, to actually work with those residents, educate them about why the buffers are important. And in Lake Clifton, we have a threatened ecological community of thrombolites. So I spoke about yesterday, but I'll spook again, we've got 1 million of them down there. They're really reliant on freshwater input, for example. So it's working with landholders to say the water that you could be using, the water you're using could instead be going to the thrombolites. So have that in your mind when you're using your water. Exclude your stock from wandering down into the lake. Those sorts of messages. So it's an education thing that's really important. You made a really good point that we do actually engage with that community and not treat them like a bunch of pariahs because they're living where we think they shouldn't be. So, yeah.
Thanks, Stephen. I couldn't agree more that the Peel Harvey Catchment Council are really a beacon for how community can learn from having an organised structure like the Peel Harvey Catchment Council to get those important messages across.
Michael, sorry. First, I would like to say that I really stand up for people like you because you have a corporate knowledge that is unequal to, and so coming here, we all know that buffers are a very contentious topic, and I respect you even more for for having the courage to stand up for an audience that is so concerned about the conservation of wetlands. And I think from my perspective, and I worked at DBCA before, the state government is the machine that runs the state, and therefore I know that decision makers at the state government at various departments are highly pressured by all economic pathways that that create and nurture the economy of. So I guess first I wanted to acknowledge that and thank you for your participation. For in a way your talk, the essence of your talk was the couple of things you said before you started. That pressure that comes with presenting and discussing these topics. You mentioned several times how could things work better? How could things balance that pressure that comes from development on top of decision makers in the state government? You mentioned the value of community, and you mentioned you had hope on the policy. What could counterbalance that pressure that state government decision makers feel in terms of protection of these environmental assets?
And yeah, that's a great question, and I have been asked that question in various forms before. How can government policy be influenced? What's the best way? And part of my role in the department is providing advice to the minister on 2 letters that the minister may receive from the community. And so it goes to public service, and public service provides the wisdom of how government operates on the ground to the minister, and then the minister will often deliver that as an answer. I don't think it's the most effective way to make changes. And so what is? It's multifactorial. It's having a function like this, a conference like this, and my hat's off to the Wetland Conservation Society over the years for hosting it. They've just done a brilliant job. And I think Tom and the Wetland Centre have taken that on and have done a brilliant job in evolving it this year into a 2-day conference. And so my hat off to Tom and the board and all the fantastic work and partners that have made that happen. It's an important part of it. So many other important parts. Peel Harvey Catchment Council, as you say, is another part of that solution. I think having the confidence when you're attending events where the government officials are at, taking them aside and having a chat about the concerns you have on environmental issues and wetlands in particular is something that seems to be effective, and even requesting meetings. And I know Heidi, working with Lake Claremont, have done a brilliant job in engaging with government staff, and if anyone's been to that lake, it's just a tribute to the efforts of that community group. And Heidi, I know how much work you put into that, and the success they've had in gaining important funding to do that work, and the community support for it.
Thanks.
Academic institutions have a really important role to engage collaboratively with government agencies, and that is happening. And the other way around too. I think government agencies, if we can relax a little bit and accept the support and input from research institutions and some of the committees they set up and some of the opportunities to learn together. And some of the other committees have been established over the years, which have included academics and local government representatives, catchment group representatives, independent scientists and conservation lobby groups. These have been important mechanisms to change policy in government. They need reinventing every so often and reinvigorating, and so, as I said, we're all part of the problem, but we can all be part of the solution as well. And so coming here to this conference, attending and being part of your local friends of groups is critical, and being part of the conversation and learning from the Indigenous owners of this land is also critical part of that story. I've probably missed lots of them, but that's a few thoughts.
So I think on that note, we might wrap up the excellent morning session that we've had today. So please give your thanks to all the speakers who presented so well today.